Unleash the Green Tide. Today we're talking Orks, and let's see just how much violence the Ork boys can mete out in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're returning to the Greenskin Hordes for another datasheet review, and this time I thought we'd focus on the rank and file Ork boys themselves. There's nothing more orky than a whole bunch of lads charging right up to you and getting to work with Slugger and Chopper, and the new codex has maybe been a bit of a mixed blessing for these guys, getting a really quite nice toughness 5 and some melee boosts, but also quite drastically reducing their stratagem and morale support. In the video we'll have a talk over their datasheet, some of the main buffs and synergies that can be used within Codex Orks to make them even more violent or tough, a little bit on the damage output of a typical squad, how I think about using them in game, and finish up with a bit of thoughts as to how they stack up compared with other units in Codex Orks. Plenty to talk about with these hyper-violent greenskins, so let's just get straight into it. So here we have the datasheet for your standard Ork boys in 9th edition. They're of course a trooper's choice. You can get between 1 and 30 of them in a squad. They cost 9 points per model, and they have a fairly beefy stat line. A movement of 5, weapon skill 3+, an Orky ballistic skill of 5+, strength 4, toughness 5, 1 wound, 2 attacks, leadership 6 and a 6+ save. And the unit does include a knob which gets them up to leadership 7, and he's a pretty stacked unit leader with strength 5, 2 wounds, 3 attacks. In general they do a fair bit more damage in melee rather than shooting, as you can see by their profile, and the boost to toughness 5 has made them a lot more resilient against enemy weapons, particularly mass fire like bolters just won't do anywhere near as much to them as it used to, only wounding them on 5s rather than 4s. I feel like their durability now can be a bit all or nothing. Lots of squads will struggle to wound the toughness 5, but you're almost guaranteed to be losing models at every single round of shooting. Anything that does make a wound roll of 5 or 6 usually means that you're going to lose an Ork boy. Not all that pleasant when they cost 9 points each. At base, each model is armed with a Slugger, Chopper and stick bombs. Chopper's of course getting that nice boost in the 9th edition codex, getting AP -1 and an extra attack, often meaning around double the melee damage output against quite a few targets. You can choose to replace the Slugger and Chopper with the Shooter, a Daka 3-2 weapon, so 3 shots at 9 inches, 2 shots at 18, and a strength 4, AP nothing and damage 1. For me, I think out of the two, the Slugger and Chopper is the better choice at the moment. It makes them actually dangerous in melee, as opposed to kind of underwhelming in both shooting and melee. The change to Daka 3-2 for shooters was kind of a mixed blessing, as it means they can no longer advance and shoot with them. Not so great when you're only moving 5 inches. I feel like Slugger and Chopper is the default way that you want to go with boys currently. Taking shooters maybe just relegated to a few more niche roles, maybe if you're certain that they're just going to be objective holders and aren't going to be going forward, or perhaps if you're going to be finding a way to get them in range reliably, either piling out of transports, or taking them in a very shooty detachment such as Bad Moons. In general though, I do prefer the Slugger and Chopper. I just feel like it makes the squad far more dangerous. Otherwise you can choose to replace one Ork's weapon with either a big shooter or rocket launcher, 1 for every 10 models in the squad. Personally I don't feel like these are the best investment in points right now. The rocket launcher's not bad, but it's kind of at odds with the Ork boys wanting to be moving each turn, and the big shooter's perhaps slightly underwhelming damage increase for the 5 points it brings. Out of the two I'd probably take the big shooter, though I don't think it's likely to be an upgrade that really changes what the squad does all that much. Finally, the squad's knob can be upgraded with a fair few weapons. He can choose to replace his Slugger and Chopper with 2 out of the following melee weapons: big choppers, kill saws, power claws, power stabbers, or sluggers. Perhaps one of the nicest things out of this list is that he can take 2 choppers if he really wants to. That means at no additional points cost whatsoever. It means that your knob can actually have an extra 2 attacks, basically being a 9-point model that can strike 5 times at strength 5, AP -1. No bad thing at all. I would be quite tempted to sub out one of those choppers though for one of the other weapons on the list, just to give the squad a little bit more bite against things with multi-wounds. I think the big chopper, power claw or kill saw are all reasonable choices. Big choppers are 5 points, and the power claw and the kill saw are both 10. And I think they're all pretty comparable value for what they give you in terms of extra strength, damage and AP. The power stabber though just really isn't worth it in comparison for the points. Finally, you do have the option to trade out the knob's Slugger and Chopper with either a combi rocket or combi scorcher. I guess perhaps the scorcher could be interesting enough if you are trying to go for a really shooty squad, but it is a shame to lose AP -1 on the knob's attacks, as he is pretty good in a fight. Just in general though, I'd be looking at taking Sluggers and Choppers, probably leaving the heavy weapons, and considering giving the knob some sort of upgrade like a big chopper or power claw. In terms of special rules, they have Here We Go for reroll charges, Mob rule for a little bit of leadership resistance, that's the one that gives them only failing on ones next to other bigger squads, and Waaagh to give them a big boost into combat. Finally, keywords wise, most of it is fairly obvious. They are infantry, they have the mob keyword, are core, but perhaps most interestingly have the tank buster bombs keyword, which allows them to use that stratagem, which is actually quite a powerful punch against vehicles that they might struggle to chew through. Overall, I think they're a fairly efficient troops choice. Very dangerous in combat for the cost, relatively tanky, perhaps the main weaknesses being that they're a touch on the slow side, and have issues with morale if you do decide to field them in big numbers. Leadership 7 just isn't all that great, and even if mob rule is triggering, you're still likely to lose a few more boys to morale if you are going to max out squads. Next up, let's talk about what other things we can use to get more out of the boys on the tabletop. As being the core troops choice for the army, pretty much most of the clans are useful in some way. I would say out of any of them, the Goths really do stand out as ones that you might want to go for if you are thinking about fielding a whole bunch of boys in your list. Exploding 6s to hit make every single squad's combat more dangerous, and also getting +1 strength on the charge goes to strength 5, which is a really big deal on strength 4 weapons. You go to wounding marines on 3s, and helps a lot against toughness 5 and toughness 8 things as well. If you want to try and make a traditional Orc green tide work, I think Goths are a really nice choice. Otherwise, Evil Sons can help out with a bit more faster foot slogging. +1 to move in advance should get them across the table faster, though it's a bit of a shame they lost the +1 to charge. Snakebites will make them a little bit tougher against strength 6 or 7 attacks, or anything with +1 to wound. Death Skulls with their rerolls help out things like claws and rockets, individual powerful attacks within the unit. Though I think maybe Death Skulls incentivise some of the other Orc mobs, things like Storm Boys and Commandos, as they give them all Obsec as well. Blood Axes can give you cover and fallback and charge. Bad Moons are arguably some of the best for shooter boys. A bit of extra range and AP on Daka weapons is no bad thing, plus they have a nice stratagem. And Freebooters could potentially allow your shooter boys to be hitting on 4s, though I think they tend to be more powerful on the more dedicated Orc gunline units. Generally though, I think it's going to be hard to beat Goths if you are running a more melee-focused Orc foot list. As well as clans, it does depend on whether you're going for a Waaagh or a Speed Waaagh. Basically, boys are going to be a lot better if you're just using a standard Waaagh. They really like the extra +1 attack and the advance and charge. Certainly makes them a lot more viable if you aren't building up some sort of speed freak list. For character support, maybe one of the easiest buffs is the +1 to hit from a war boss nearby, or 4 rerolls if you're using Ghazghkull Thraka. Extra melee damage certainly isn't any bad thing, particularly if you're Goths already. You could think about using things like custom force fields and pain boys to amp up durability, but I must admit both of these do seem a bit more hard to justify including in the new codex compared with the old. I feel like with the changes of the stratagems and the changes to mob rule, you're a lot more incentivized to run small units of orcs rather than huge units of 30, and they perhaps just don't benefit quite as well from these nice upgrades. The custom force field only giving a 6+ invul really is a bit of a kick in the teeth. Even if the enemy isn't shooting at you with AP0 weapons which wouldn't care, you'd still need to lose something like 60 orc boys to enemy fire before you've even broken even compared with just taking more boys in the first place. It just seems like the custom force field and pain boy combination that was so prevalent in the previous decks really doesn't seem to have made its way into this one in the way that orcs are going to be most normally played. Finally, Weird Boys can be pretty useful for the Jump and Warpath, both of which are quite decent spells for buffing boys, and Weird Boys do tend to be a bit stronger in any list with a fair amount of Orc infantry, as they can basically power him up with the Waaagh energy and allow him to cast 2 spells per turn. If you are running a significant amount of foot sloggers, it might well be worth including one. The extra mobility and jumping around with the jump can be pretty handy indeed. Next up we come to the specialist mobs, and perhaps one of the most competitive ways to field Orc boys at the moment in Truck Boys. They're one of the specialist mobs that you can take 1 per detachment of, and they have the quite nice advantage that if you put them in a truck, they can get out after it moves, and still go on to move and charge after that. With trucks having a 12-inch move at base, you could have a pretty crazy threat range out of these guys, and could quite easily and reliably be charging enemy units all the way into their deployment zone with no real sweat. I'd argue that that kind of mobility and threat range on a fairly angry close combat unit is really quite nice to have, and if you're not using those specialist mobs elsewhere, then it seems like a unit of these in a truck in an Orc detachment could often be worth it. Otherwise, you could potentially use things like Mad Boys or Sneaky Gits. For me though, those are far more passable to be not really wanting to give up the clan trait most of the time. I guess you could maybe have it if it was a very melee-centered Orc mob in a very shooty Orc detachment like say Bad Moons. Still though, I don't think they're exactly stellar. Finally, being a core troops unit, there's really quite a lot of stratagems that the boys have access to. First up, and maybe one of the most easy direct damage dealing ones, is Tank Buster Bomb for 1 CP. You only get to make one attack, but if you hit, you get a pretty massive 2d3 mortal wounds on an enemy vehicle. That's a pretty hefty punch for 1 CP, could be really worth it against the biggest and heaviest vehicles. Otherwise, there's a fair few that could perhaps be situationally useful. Teleporter might be one way to get a whole bunch of shooters in range. Maybe if you were playing Bad Moons and they can dacker all the way out to 12 inches. Get Stuck In could give you a bonus pile and consolidate if you really want to swarm the enemy objectives or tag other units. Breaking Heads could give you a leadership pass for a big mob if they're near a war boss, though it is very command point expensive and it does deal direct damage to your unit, so it is kind of painful I think. Tide of Muscle could be handy if you're charging into difficult terrain to ignore charge roll modifiers. More Dacker could perhaps be handy on shooter boys for dackering out to maximum range if you've got enough boys to make it worth it. And Grot Shields could theoretically keep an Orc mob safe for a turn if you have brought some Gretchen along. In general though, I'd say most of these are pretty situational. Tank Buster Bomb seems great if you can use it. There's certainly a whole less auto-use stratagems than there were in the previous codex, where you could do things like fighting twice, or regenerating the squad once they reached half health or less. Next I thought we'd just take a quick look at their damage output in melee. This is for just a small squad of orcs with 10 boys with choppers, including a nob with a big chopper within that unit. So 95 points of boys, all getting into melee. This is roughly what you might expect them to do. Just at base, say if they had no clan trait, for example say they were truck boys, they'd really make a nasty mess of light infantry, say 11 dead guardsmen, but will struggle a little bit more against more heavily armoured targets, only killing around about 3 marines, and are pretty underwhelming against vehicles, do about 4 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. If you did have one of them throw a Tank Buster Bomb, on average that would generate you 2 or 3 more mortal wounds. That's taking into account the fact that you might fail to hit with it. If it does hit, then it's on average 4. Things do get significantly better though if you apply any buffs. If your boys are Goths, then that goes up to 14 dead guardsmen, 5 dead marines, or 5 to 6 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. The strength 5 in particular really comes into play against the Space Marines. Wounding them on 3s is just so much better than 4s. Similarly, if you are playing in a Waaagh list, then you could get +1 attack with that for a turn or 2. The Waaagh actually does slightly better than the Goths against light infantry, but is not quite as overwhelming against tougher targets. Really though, for the pinnacle of Orky violence just self-buffing themselves, if you are playing with Goths in Waaagh, you go up to a pretty mighty 19 dead guardsmen out of just a single 10-boy squad, 6 or 7 dead Space Marines, or around 7 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. That's really not too bad at all out of a 95 point basic troops choice. I think their damage output certainly gets there, it's just perhaps more a problem of actually delivering them into combat. So here's how I think about fielding boys in a standard game of 40k then. For me at the moment, I just don't really think that the big 30 boy squads really make that much sense. They're very intimidating, but are quite restrictive in terms of things like coherency. They expose you to leadership issues, you're going to struggle to hide them as much around the board, and you also expose them to more damage with blast weapons. On top of that, with their larger base sizes and only fighting in 2 ranks, you might also struggle to bring them all to bear in melee if there isn't all that much space for them. For that reason I'd typically be fielding them more in 10 boy squads at the moment, perhaps going for a bit more of a multiple small unit approach. 10 boys completely at base with choppers, perhaps giving the knob something like a power claw or a big chopper seems like a reasonable way to go. In terms of how many squads to field, it's certainly fun to field big green tide orc lists, though at the moment it's most certainly not the Codex's strongest build. The lists that are stomping tournaments at the moment seem to revolve around buggies, flyers and other orc vehicles, with infantry more there in a supporting role. I still think that boys certainly can have a place in these though. They can fill out troop slots, provide a bit of Auspex for objectives, and be a fairly hefty countercharge threat that might make your opponent think twice about getting too close to the orky lines. I just think for the strongest use, you're better off relying on other orc units to be damage dealers, and have a few units of boys fill in the gaps. I'm certainly not saying that you can't field some entire armies of infantry equivalents though. Toughness 5 is really quite intimidating, and if you start getting towards 200 models worth of those, a lot of lists are going to struggle to cope with that and stop you getting on the objectives. Kind of depends as to what sort of level of opponents you're playing, and how easy they might find it to deal with mass infantry. Generally though, unless you're just going for the very orky approach of flooding the board with bodies and charging straight at the opponent, I'd probably be playing a little bit more cagey with orc boy squads, either holding backfield objectives, advancing towards the middle ones and making good use of line of sight cover, and probably go for a bit more of a multiple small unit approach, as opposed to fielding loads of boys around a whole bunch of characters and sinking loads of points into orc buffs. I think perhaps another reason that orc boys aren't appearing quite so much in tournament lists is that they have quite a lot of rivals within Codex Orks itself. Just within the troop section, Beast Snagger boys and Gretchen both do provide genuine alternatives to them, depending on what you're going for. Gretchen are per point far punier than boys. For their damage and toughness, they're kind of not worth 50 points. But that doesn't mean that they can't be the best choice in some circumstances if you are just looking for a unit to hold an objective, maybe do an action or two, and nothing else. You could put the 40 points saved into more aggressive orc units going forward. Beast Snagger boys are a bit more of a complicated competitor though, being very similar to the orc boys, but basically paying 2 points extra per model for a whole bunch of extra advantages. They get their 6+ invul, base strength 5, better attacks versus vehicles and monsters, a free power snapper on the knob, and a few handy stratagems, including that one to only be wounded on a 4+. I did do a bit of a comparison between the two of them in a previous video, and overall I feel that for their damage and durability, Games Workshop has done a pretty good job of balancing the two. I think when all things are considered, including all their special rules and stratagems, both of them have a place in the orc army, and it's quite nice that you aren't heavily incentivized to either take regular boys or beast snaggers in my opinion. Otherwise though, out of the troop slot there are a couple of other competitors, perhaps particularly more relevant if you're death scores as well, and these mobs will also get obsec. Commandos, for the extra point invested, get so much more over standard boys, perhaps one of the biggest things being their real boost to saving throws in cover, giving them effectively a 3+ armor save whenever they're in light cover against shooting attacks, but being able to forward deploy and screen, and also getting +1 to wound when they're nearby cover are both awesome advantages too. All that for 1 point does mean that they're just basically the better unit for the cost, their main disadvantage being that they aren't troops, so don't get obsec and can't fill detachments. Storm boys are a bit more simple, 2 extra points for an absolutely massive movement buff, and kind of help solve the problem of actually getting your orcs into melee by strapping a massive rocket to them. Their threat range can be very silly indeed on any turn that you call a Waaagh, and they can also make really quite nice actions and objective style units with minimum squads of them. Their innate deep strike and good movement really help with that. I'd still be looking at all of these as potential alternatives when you're building an orc list, though I still think boys have their place. Being obsec and filling the troop slot for detachments really is very handy indeed. So overall, I'd say that orc boys are a fairly solid and usable orc troops choice, just maybe overshadowed by a few of the other choices in the orc codex. I think perhaps mob rule was really quite a big deal for these guys. I'll certainly miss taking 30 strong mobs. Let me know your thoughts and experience if you have any with the new orcs down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing your insights, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly try and make a fair few more orc videos over the rest of the year. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find it down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.